Imagine spending 30 years locked inside a palace. Not as a prisoner of war, but as a prince. No education, no freedom, no future. And one day, without warning, you are told, you now rule the Ottoman Empire. Chapter 1. An empire built on blood. At the height of its power, the Ottoman Empire ruled across 3 continents, commanding armies, trade routes, and sacred cities. The Sultan was not merely a king. He was the head of state, supreme military commander, and protector of Sunni Islam. His authority was considered divinely sanctioned, and the survival of the empire depended on one central reality. There could only ever be one ruler. Unlike European monarchies with clear primogeniture, the Ottomans followed no fixed rule of succession. Any male member of the ruling dynasty could claim the throne. This ambiguity created a constant and lethal problem. When a sultan died, his sons often raced toward the capital, each backed by factions within the army or court. These succession struggles repeatedly plunged the early empire into civil war. By the 15th century, the Ottomans reached a brutal conclusion. Civil war was more dangerous than murder. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, formalized this logic into law. In his imperial code, he declared that whichever son ascended the throne was permitted to execute his brothers, for the good order of the world. Fratricide was not a crime. It was policy. This practice was neither secret nor controversial within the ruling elite. Princes were strangled with silk cords to avoid shedding royal blood, often immediately after a new sultan's accession. Infants, teenagers, and grown men alike were eliminated. The objective was absolute stability. No rivals, no claims, no wars of succession. Yet beneath this cold logic lay an unresolved tension. The empire survived, but at a profound human cost. Power was preserved through fear, and mercy was treated as a threat. For generations, the Ottoman state chose certainty over compassion, until even that solution began to break under its own weight. Chapter 2. From fratricide to a more humane solution. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman system of fratricide began to face serious resistance. What had once been accepted as a harsh but necessary political rule was increasingly questioned by religious scholars, court officials, and the public. The execution of princes, especially children, conflicted with Islamic principles that placed strong limits on the killing of innocents. The moral cost of stability was becoming impossible to ignore. There was also a growing psychological toll on the sultans themselves. To ascend the throne often meant ordering the deaths of brothers, nephews, or even sons. Ottoman chroniclers describe rulers burdened by fear, guilt, and anxiety over divine punishment. Some delayed executions, others sought religious justification, and a few attempted to avoid the practice altogether. The policy that once guaranteed order was now creating hesitation and instability at the very top. At the same time, the center of power inside the empire was shifting. The imperial harem, palace eunuchs, and senior bureaucrats gained greater influence over succession. These groups favored a system that preserves potential heirs while keeping them politically powerless. Control became more valuable than elimination. Out of this environment emerged a new solution. Princes would no longer be killed. Instead, they would be confined within the palace, cut off from public life, politics, and military command. This institution became known as the Kafes, or the cage. Formally introduced during the reign of Sultan Ahmed I in the early 17th century. The Kafes was presented as a merciful reform. In practice, it replaced execution with lifelong isolation. The empire had not abandoned fear as a tool of rule, it had simply transformed it. Chapter 3. Inside the Kafes, the Golden Prison. The Kafes was not a single cell, but a secluded complex of rooms hidden deep within Istanbul's Topkapi Palace. From the outside, it was invisible, no towers, no bars, no chains. Yet for the Ottoman princes confined within it, the Kafes functioned as a prison. In every meaningful sense, entry was permanent. Exit was uncertain. Freedom did not exist. The princes lived in relative physical comfort. Their chambers were furnished with carpets, cushions, and fine textiles. They were provided servants, food, and clothing appropriate to their royal status. But this luxury concealed a harsher reality. The doors were locked, movement was restricted. Contact with the outside world was almost entirely forbidden. Princes were not allowed to leave the palace grounds. They could not ride horses, attend military training, or observe governance. Even learning was limited, unlike Ottoman princes who were sent to provincial governorships to gain experience. In administration and warfare, Kafes princes received no preparation for rule. They were intentionally kept ignorant of politics, military command, and statecraft. Surveillance was constant. Eunuchs and palace officials monitored conversations, routines, and visitors. Information was tightly controlled. News of wars, deaths, or succession crises often reached the princes late, or not at all. This isolation was deliberate. Knowledge itself was considered dangerous. The psychological impact was severe. Many princes entered the cafes as children and spent decades inside, with no sense of purpose, no responsibility, and no certainty about their future. Time lost all structure. Some princes reportedly developed extreme anxiety, paranoia, or emotional withdrawal. The ever-present possibility of execution remained, as confinement did not guarantee survival. The cafes was designed to neutralize threats without bloodshed. It achieved this by erasing autonomy. Princes were kept alive but stripped of identity, ambition, and agency. They existed in a suspended state, neither rulers nor ordinary men, waiting for a summons that might never come. What the Ottoman state created was not merely a physical enclosure, but a system of enforced stagnation. And when the gates of the cafes finally opened, the empire would soon discover the cost of raising rulers in captivity. Chapter 4: Princes. Raised to do nothing for centuries, Ottoman princes were trained for power through responsibility. As adolescents, they were sent to govern distant provinces, where they learned administration, military command, and the realities of rule. This system produced rulers hardened by experience and tested by failure. The cafes ended that tradition entirely. Princes confined within the palace were denied any meaningful role. They did not govern, command troops, or participate in court politics. Decisions were made around them, never by them. Their lives were structured to avoid risk, not to build competence. Even routine choices were handled by attendance. Education, when provided, was narrow and controlled. Some princes learned basic religious instruction or literature, but training in governance or warfare was deliberately withheld. The state did not want prepared rulers. It wanted compliant survivors. Knowledge, independence, and ambition were seen as threats. Life inside the cafes was dominated by observation. Palace eunuchs, guards, and officials constantly monitored the princes. Conversations were reported. Alliances were discouraged. Isolation was enforced not only through walls, but through fear. A careless word could be interpreted as political intent. The fear of execution never disappeared. Although the cafes was presented as an alternative to fratricide, confinement offered no legal protection. A prince could still be killed if court politics demanded it. This uncertainty fostered deep paranoia. Many princes learned to suppress emotion, avoid attention, and retreat inward. By removing challenge, responsibility, and growth, the system produced men unprepared for leadership. They were heirs to a global empire, yet denied every opportunity to understand it. The Ottoman state succeeded in preventing rebellion, but at the cost of competence. When succession finally arrived, the empire would be placing absolute power in the hands of men who had never exercised authority of any kind. Chapter 5: When prisoners became sultans. When a reigning sultan died without sons, or when political factions agreed on a successor, the doors of the cafes were finally opened. Men who had spent decades in isolation were suddenly summoned to rule one of the largest empires in the world. The transition was abrupt and unforgiving. There was no gradual preparation, no apprenticeship, no support structure. Absolute power was handed to men who lived most of their lives under constant surveillance and fear. Some princes ascended the throne after 20 or 30 years of confinement. They emerged unfamiliar with military command, administrative systems, or the personalities of the court. The world they inherited had changed while they stood still. Wars had been fought, borders shifted, and institutions evolved, without their participation or understanding. Historical records describe several sultans who struggled immediately upon accession. Mustafa I, released from the Kafes in 1617, showed clear signs of mental instability. Contemporary sources describe erratic behavior and an inability to govern, leading to his removal from the throne twice. Ibrahim I, confined for most of his life, ascended in 1640 deeply traumatized, obsessed with threats, and distrustful of nearly everyone around him. In these circumstances, real power often shifted away from the sultan. Court factions, senior bureaucrats, military elites, and members of the imperial harem filled the vacuum. Decisions were made in the sultan's name, not by his will. Weak or inexperienced rulers were manipulated, isolated, or overridden entirely. The Kafes had succeeded in preventing immediate succession wars. But when prisoners became emperors, the system revealed its deeper flaw. It produced rulers unprepared for leadership, vulnerable to control, and unable to command authority. The empire gained stability in theory, while losing it in practice. Chapter 6: Madness, Addiction, and Silence. The long years spent inside the Kafes left marks that power could not erase. When former prisoners became sultans, many carried deep psychological damage shaped by isolation, fear, and uncertainty. Ottoman chroniclers and foreign observers recorded patterns of paranoia, depression, and emotional instability among several rulers raised in confinement. Sultan Ibrahim I offers one of the clearest examples. Confined in the Kafes for much of his life, he lived in constant fear of execution. When he became sultan in 1640, his reign was marked by extreme suspicion, erratic decision-making, and withdrawal from state affairs. Contemporary accounts describe a ruler deeply anxious about conspiracies, often isolating himself and relying heavily on palace intermediaries. Escapism became a common response. Some sultans retreated into the pleasures of the palace, food, luxury, and the harem, while others avoided governance altogether. This was not decadence in the abstract, but a coping mechanism formed under prolonged confinement. The sudden burden of absolute authority, combined with lifelong emotional suppression, proved overwhelming. In many cases, silence replaced leadership. Sultans delegated extensively or disengaged from daily governance, allowing viziers and court officials to rule in their stead. Decisions affecting war, finance, and administration were often made without the sultan's direct involvement. The throne remained occupied, but its voice weakened. These rulers were not born incapable. They were shaped by a system that froze development and punished initiative. The Kafes did not merely isolate princes, it arrested emotional and psychological growth. The empire came to be governed by men whose formative years were defined not by leadership, but by survival. The cost of this silence would soon extend far beyond the palace walls. Chapter 7: The System That Ate the Empire. By the 17th century, the consequences of the Kafes were no longer confined to the inner palace. They were visible across the empire. As sultans raised in isolation struggled to assert authority, real power increasingly shifted into the hands of bureaucrats, military elites, and palace networks. The office of the Grand Vizier became the true center of governance, while the sultan often served as a symbolic figurehead. This transfer of authority coincided with a period of military and administrative strain. The Ottoman army, once feared across Europe and the Middle East, began to suffer defeats and stagnation. Campaigns were poorly coordinated, leadership inconsistent, and reform resisted. Sultans who lacked experience in warfare or governance were ill-equipped to impose discipline or challenge entrenched interests. Inside the palace, factional politics intensified. The imperial harem, senior eunuchs, and court officials competed to influence weak rulers. Succession was no longer decided by strength or competence, but by manipulation and access. Stability had been preserved, but decisiveness had been sacrificed. The Kafes itself became a symbol of this transformation. It represented an empire that no longer trusted its own heirs. Fear replaced confidence as the guiding principle of rule. Potential leaders were neutralized before they could ever prove themselves. This system did not cause the Ottoman Empire's decline on its own. External pressures, economic changes, and military challenges all played critical roles. But the Kafes ensured that when these challenges arose, the empire was often led by men unprepared to respond. What began as a solution to chaos gradually became a source of weakness. In attempting to control the future, the Ottoman state limited its own capacity to adapt. The cage designed to protect the empire slowly turned inward, constraining the very power it was meant to preserve. Chapter 8. Was the Kafes worse than death? For the Ottomans, the Kafes was designed as a moral compromise. It replaced execution with confinement and promised stability without bloodshed. Yet its long-term effects raise a question that historians still debate. Was lifelong isolation truly more humane than death? Fratricide ended lives quickly and decisively. The Kafes, by contrast, preserved life while stripping it of purpose, autonomy, and certainty. Princes could spend decades confined, unaware of political realities, disconnected from society, and unsure whether they would ever leave, or be executed without warning. Survival itself became a form of punishment. Contemporary Ottoman sources rarely describe open resistance from the princes. The system discouraged ambition so effectively that many internalized their powerlessness. This silence has led historians to argue that the Kafes succeeded precisely because it broke the will, not the body. From the state's perspective, the trade-off appeared rational. Civil wars were avoided, succession became predictable. But the human cost was profound. The Kafes dehumanized even those born to rule, reducing princes to political variables rather than individuals. This dilemma was not unique to the Ottomans. Many early modern states faced similar tensions between stability and morality. What set the Kafes apart was its longevity and scale. It institutionalized psychological imprisonment as state policy. Whether it was worse than death depends on perspective. What is clear is that the Kafes did not eliminate violence, it merely transformed it. Physical execution gave way to prolonged mental erosion, carried out quietly behind palace walls. In the name of order and survival. Chapter 9. Legacy of the Golden Cage. By the 18th century, the Kafes had lost much of its original purpose. Succession practices slowly evolved, and the confinement of princes became less rigid. As the Ottoman Empire confronted military defeats, territorial losses, and internal reform movements, attention shifted toward modernization and survival. The empire no longer had the luxury of rulers unprepared for leadership. During the late Ottoman period, particularly in the 19th century, reforms aimed at rational governance and legal modernization reduced the role of the Kafes. Princes began receiving more structured education, and the system of lifelong isolation gradually faded. It was never formally abolished in a single decree, but it quietly disappeared as the empire restructured itself. Historians now view the Kafes as a reflection of deep institutional anxiety. It was a system born from fear of civil war, fear of rival claimants, fear of instability. In attempting to eliminate chaos, the Ottoman state sacrificed human development at the highest level of power. The legacy of the Kafes is not measured only in weak rulers or political decline. It lies in the lesson it offers about governance itself. When a system prioritizes control over competence and security over growth, it undermines its own foundations. The Ottoman princes confined within the Golden Cage were born into unimaginable power, yet denied the experience of living freely. Some would eventually rule an empire. Many never would. All were shaped by a system that treated survival as obedience. They were princes who inherited the world, after being taught how to disappear from it. If you value real history told without myths or exaggeration, subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are already on the way.